At Odds and Ends by Corndog / Patrol and For the Wolfie on AO3. Chapter 12. Formal Interview. 9 days remaining. The cello was not Shota's forte. What really took him by surprise was the weight of it, or the lack thereof. For such a bulky instrument, it was hollow and easy enough to move around. He never even held an instrument before, let alone played one, and even getting the correct pose for it was difficult to accomplish consistently. At least Hizashi was gentle with his corrections, unlike Shota's vampire slaying instructor, although he did his best to pretend he hadn't had his revelation last night. Hizashi had a crush on him. You need to keep the bow as straight as possible, Hizashi repeated for the 4th time. His hands met Shota's and corrected the angle, although he wasn't quick to release the hold. The movement comes from the elbow, not the wrist. Hizashi moved Shota's arms a few times to show the correct elbow movements. The cello groaned monotonously, the strings untouched by anything but the bow. The vampire's hands was warm against his. Can you show me again? Shouta asked, mostly wanting an excuse to listen to Hizashi's, far superior, playing than dealing with his own inaccuracy. Hizashi nodded and took the cello from him, showing him the correct position of the instrument and his feet. I'll play the simple piece, okay? Bach Cello Suite number 1. Shouta nodded and sat back to watch the small performance. The blonde positioned the end pin between his feet, and Shouta wondered if it could be used as a weapon. It simply seemed sharp enough to stab, although killing vampires with a cello would have been unwieldy. His silly thoughts vanished when Hizashi played. Just with the violin, Hizashi's left hand moved like a spider across the strings, if less frantically than the last time. His movements came from the shoulders and elbows, while his wrists and fingers worked to keep the bow both steady and straight. However, before the piece was finished, there was a knock at the door. Hizashi immediately stopped playing, and Shouta was free from whatever spell he'd been under. Come in, the blonde called, moving the cello away from his body. The door opened to reveal Tensei, although Kan was leaning against the wall outside. He was Hizashi's bodyguard after all, although he seemed to cling closer to his master today. I apologize for the interruption, said the butler with a smile. There's a guest for Shouta. The human blinked in surprise at the announcement. He had a guest. Her name is Emi Fukado? Oh, Hizashi said with a smile of recognition. That's the woman from the government building. She said she'd check in on Shouta to make sure he was settling in okay. Please have something whipped for her, if possible. Tensei nodded and wheeled away, while Hizashi eagerly stood. Shall we? Shouta glanced away. I should probably meet her alone. That caused Hizashi to deflate. She might think I'm being pressured if you're in the room, he explained. At least at first. I'm sure she'll want to talk to you after me. Hizashi exhaled, looking thoroughly disappointed. Yeah, okay. You know the usual reception room? Hizashi stood and nodded. Thanks for the lesson. You play very well, as always. Hizashi's smile returned. And one day you'll be able to play just as well. Shouta doubts went unvoiced as he nodded and left the room, beelining for the same room Tensei had hosted Bastinus on his previous visit. When he had opened the door, he was greeted by the sight of Emi, nervously tapping her leg. When she looked at him, her face was a mixture of relief and amazement. Shouta, you look so good. She stood and went to embrace him, but he sidestepped. The last thing he needed right now was a fractured spine. Did you spruce up so much so you could ask my hand in marriage? He rolled his eyes and ensured the door was firmly closed before he sat down on one of the multiple couches. Any updates on your end? Emi dropped onto the couch opposite his, lying across it, and sighed. Nothing. How about on your end? I was expecting to find you in the Latest stoner fashion. I thought you looked great in cat ears, one. He rolled his eyes. Thankfully, I hadn't been forced to parade around in skimpy lingerie. Shouta scratched the back of his neck. The household seems okay, but something's off about each one. Did you manage to find anything about them? Oh! She sat up with a jerking motion. I found out a bit about the two vampires and the human maid. Shouta eyed the door weirdly. How about you lower your voice? Right, she whispered. Well, apparently Obra Shirokuma was experimented on as a baby. The government did that a lot with vampire orphans about 30 years back. They were really curious about how quirks formed. However, after a mechanical tone of backlash, laws were put in place to stop it. So he was put into the foster care system, and that's where the paper trail ends. Shoulda nodded. It explains the oddity of the yellow eye and the purple in his cloudy hair. Just like with the other vampires, he was strange. Kitojiro-kan's record is super normal, she said with a shrug. His quirk is about controlling blood, and there was a note in there that his foster parents wrote. Apparently, even with the upside-down fangs, he was able to drink blood thanks to his quirk. So that explained how he survived into adulthood. There was a file for Tensei Ida too, but for some reason I didn't have credentials to access it. That made Shouta tilt his head. Is that normal? Not really. She kicked out her legs. He might have some friends higher up in the government. That's the only explanation I can think of. And Nomuri-kanma? Emmy reached into an oversized pocket and pulled out a crumpled newspaper clipping. This was from about 10 years back. Shouta took the piece, and his stomach fell as soon as he read the title. Woman rescued from vampire cult. There was an image paired with it of a 20-year-old Nomuri, a towel wrapped around her. Her arm was hugged over it, though, and he could see the rows of fangs scarred that dotted her skin. The article did little to relieve his sense of dread. Apparently, her blood contained a symbiotic quality that could put vampires to sleep. The cult had kidnapped her at a young age, and she'd become a living blood bag to a dozen feral vampires, who kept her just alive enough to be a source of food and sleep. Something Nomuri once said to him stood out. Some people get a kick out of things that are supposed to hurt them. The vampires in this mayor weren't the ones who wounded her. How desperate had she been? However, to only find sanctuary in a mayor of vampires. Had she really had no place to go? Shouta inhaled until his lungs ached. Nomuri wasn't brainwashed. While he still didn't believe the vampires were being completely innocent, he could at least agree that this place was her sanctuary. Hizashi and his monolith of crews of leeches would never harm her, and she didn't need rescuing. He'd only been there for about a week, and yet he was already willing to accept that. Thank you, he said gently, and offered the paper back. Shouta didn't need to read it further. Anything about Hizashi? Emmy bobbed her head a little, in concentration. It was cleaner than a bathtub, she said with a shrug. A real clean bathtub. Like, imagine a bathtub that had been scrubbed and then bleached like 4 or 5 times, and then scrubbed again for extra measure. Shouta raised an eyebrow. That does sound clean. But it's too clean, she said loudly, before dropping back to a whisper. I tried to check out his family listed on there, but I couldn't find anything. It's almost like they never existed. It doesn't even list his quirk. And apparently he got adopted when he was like 11, but it's listed as redacted. Who would name their child redacted? It's a terrible name. Shouta was taken back. Hisashi told me his father shot him. He even showed me the wound. Emmy shook her head. Nothing like that on his file. Are you saying he lied? I'm saying someone powerful had scrubbed his file and then bleached it like 4 or 5 times and then scrubbed it again for extra. Okay, I get it, he grumbled. Look into it. Emmy nodded and bounced a little on the sofa. And you? How are things on your side? Shouta sighed. Apparently, we chose the only considerate vampires in existence. So far, he refused to take me to Overhaul's ball because he's worried I'll get taken. His hands curled into a fist. He drank from me once, but now he realized how much I hate vampires. He refused to drink again, so I can't use my blood in a deal. She looked stunned. Well, it's not like we had much choice in our section. He was on Overhaul's invite list and was looking for a donor. Either you got super lucky or super unlucky. And, to make matters worse, my blood apparently is up. He hesitated, but there wasn't any reason to keep this information from his friend. An aphrodisiac. Emmy's immune response was to burst out laughing. She rolled back onto the couch and kicked her feet in the air, while she was clutching her sides in vain attempt to keep them attached. I told you! She cried out, both loudly and unhelpfully. Quiet, he growled, hair raising with his erasure, although she didn't have a quirk to stop. She continued to laugh. I told you we should have tested your blood beforehand. But no, you had me just forge some papers instead. Oh man, you're screwed. Emmy paused, and then immediately noticed her accidental innuendo, and resumed her doubt of painful laughter. Shota's hair fell, and he rubbed his temples. At least the activation of his own quirk reminded him of the different topic that needed mentioning. Do you know Best Jeanist? Emmy's laughing stopped, enough for her to say, yeah, he makes great clothes and works really closely with the department to make sure the professional donors are being treated well. She paused, and then instantly bolted right up, gasping far too loudly. Oh, he would see you miles away. Shh, he reminded her, and she quickly covered her mouth. Yes, he did, but I convinced him to give me 2 weeks here. We've got about 9 days left. Hopefully the ball falls within that period. However, it means I've only got one shot at this. If Hizashi refuses to let me go, then I might have to tell him the truth. Do you think you'll help if he knew? Shouta shrugged. I don't know. It's risking a lot. I think he might, but he is a vampire. He brushed away his knowledge of Hizashi's crush, knowing he couldn't rely on something so flimsy for his plan. I need more time to tell. But what if he... There was a knock at the door, and they both fell silent. They waited, but after a few seconds there was a second knock. Shouta quickly said, Come in. The door opened, and Tensei wheeled inside with some tea and biscuits. I apologize for the delay, he said with a smile, as he set the tray down between them. I hope English breakfast is okay. But it's lunchtime, Emma said with a grin, and immediately bursted into radiant laughter. Tensei looked uncertain. I can bring you something else if you prefer. Shouta shook his head. Ignore her. She's just pulling your... He glanced at the wheel chair. Pulling your arm. Tensei smiled, unoffended. You seem like good friends. Did you spend much time together during the professional doning process? Yes, Shouta said, and it wasn't exactly a lie. He didn't need to let Tensei know that they'd been friends for about 12 years now. Thank you. Tensei nodded and poured them each a cup, and from the doorway poked a head with bright blonde hair. Hey, Hizashi said with a sheepish grin. Did you need more alone time, or did you need to talk to me now as well? Shouta nearly told him to leave, but Emme waved him over. Sure, I'll interview you both together. Ah, Hizashi looked uncertain. Actually, I wanted to talk to you alone. The Slayer stared in surprise. Oh no. He was returning him after all. Shota's plan was crumbled to pieces, and the blonde sat down beside him and smiled reassuringly. I promise I'm not going to return you, he said softly, as if he could read his mind. I like having you around too much. The light in his emerald eyes was dazzling, and Shouta wanted to believe him. He stood and said to Emmy, "Thanks for checking on me." With that, Shouta left the room with Tensei, although he couldn't keep anxiety from swelling inside him. His plan now relied on Emmy. Hizashi picked up his cup of tea and finally let the smile fall from his face. "Are you always so sloppy in your screenings?" The green-haired woman was stunned. "Huh?" "Firstly, his blood is an aphrodisiac," he said firmly. "You tested his blood, but apparently you didn't think that was worth mentioning?" Her heart sped up with nerves, and she seemed possibly sheepish, as she waved her hands defensively. "Our technology has limits, sir. Sometimes blood effects are undetectable. I mean, it's not like we taste test our donors beforehand. It's never appeared in his family line before, according to our records. He must have been the first mutation." Hizashi set down his tea. "Okay, fine. That's the physical part of the screening. However, that doesn't excuse the complete negligent concern his personality. He hates vampires. Judging by the way you acted when I first signed the papers, you already knew that." "I did," she confirmed. He continued, before she could say more. "And yet you allowed him into a profession that involves being fed by the very thing he hated. Where's the concern for his mental well-being? I'm sure there are other jobs you could have helped him find, but instead you forced him into such a profession." Her chest inflated a little. "Shouta wasn't forced into anything," she said sternly, but it was a lie. Hizashi sneered. "How dare you? Is this what the human government does now? It takes vulnerable people and sells them off? In the end, you're no better than the people smugglers." The woman shook her head. "This was Shota's decision." Oddly enough, that time it wasn't a lie. Shouta knew all the expectations and requirements when he accepted the job. You shouldn't offer someone like him the job in the first place. She inhaled deeply. "Are you saying you bit him without his consent?" Guilt stalked him through the heart. "He gave consent," he said. His voice sounded winded. "But I didn't realize he hated it until—" He trailed off, but what she said next left him gutted. "Judging by the way he acted when you signed the papers," she said, an echo of her earlier words, "you already knew that." Hizashi was speechless. The woman continued. "Since you bid him if you wish to return him, then there will be a required compensation for your part to fund—" He shook his head. "No way am I returning him to you. He hates vampires, but I don't think he's scared of us. The only time I saw genuine fear in his eyes was when he thought I'd returned him to you." Hizashi didn't think it was this woman specifically, since Shouta had wanted to talk to her without him, but she was surely part of the issue. "Shouta needs stability," she said slowly. "Yes, he hates vampires, but I think you're going to help him." The woman frowned for a moment, but then something solidified in her gaze. She nodded with a new sense of resolution. "Yes, you're going to help him. I don't think I've ever heard a vampire sound so defensive about their professional donor before. He told me you were very considerate." And with those words, the woman resumed her smile. "A compliment from Shouta. I bet hell's freezing over." A small weight lifted from Hisashi's chest. "He thinks I'm considerate?" She nodded, the movements over-exaggerated. "Yup. I never even received a fine compliment from him, but you get considerate? It's totally unfair." "Do you know why?" The woman tilted her head, and he explained. "Do you know why he hates vampires?" Her smile fell. "That's confidential." Hizashi shook his head. "I wasn't asking you to tell me. I just want to know if you know." This time, the woman didn't hesitate to nod, although she couldn't look at Hizashi when she did. "Thank you." So, there was a documented reason. Still, Hizashi didn't want to learn about it from this woman. He wanted Shouta to feel comfortable enough to tell him himself. His eyes turned down, and that's when he noticed Shota's untouched cup of tea. It still had steam rising from it, but it would certainly grow cold soon. "Sorry," Hizashi said softly and made himself smile. "But I didn't catch your name." "Emi Fujikato," she said, and offered her hand, and he shook it politely. "I'm sorry for coming off so aggressive. I know you're just doing your job as best you can. I bet Shouta was very stubborn." Emi laughed a little. "Super stubborn. I think he's in good hands, though, and you seem to really care about his well-being." "I'll bring him back," he said as he stood and moved to the door. Sensei was waiting outside. He had been standing guard. "Can you get Shouta, please?" The butler nodded and wheeled away confidently. He must have known where Shouta had gone. Had he been ensuring the donor didn't eavesdrop? Hizashi sat down, and after a short wait, Shouta returned and took the seat beside him. "Everything's fine?" he asked, a tone of anxiety in his voice. "Of course," she said. "And you, Mr. Yamada?" He straightened up. "Shota's my guest here. Whether that needs to be under the title of professional donor doesn't really matter. He can stay for as long as he likes, blood or no blood." Hizashi smiled at Shouta, and the human finally met his gaze. There was no better words to describe him than relieved. "For now, then," Emi said, unable to mask her own smile. "I guess that means Shota's staying." God damn, Hizashi went strong on that woman. God damn, he's just like, this. Like, oh my god. Mans was really concerned for Shota's well-being, and I love that. I love that. Claps. Send yellow hearts in the comments for Hizashi and his appreciation and his worry for Shouta. I love that. I love that. We got revealed some of the other characters' backgrounds, like, for example, Oboro being an experiment, Trax, Nemuri? Oh my god, when I found out about it the first time I read this, I was in shock. Tensei's is classified. I know what it is, and I know why it's classified. As for cons, alright, nice, cool, love that. We got a little bit of background. Obviously, Hizashi seems to be squeaky clean, like squeaky clean. Like someone got in there and, as Emi said, scrubby-dub, bleached it 45 times and then scrubbed it one more time for extra good measure. Which, interesting. I also love how Shouta in this chapter, Shouta says, and I quote, "Hizashi is considerate," right? That's a compliment, considerate. When, most of the time, man says, "Fine, that's fine. Yeah, fine. You were fine. It was fine. Fine. Man's loves fine, right? And Emi's over here is like, "God damn, I've never even gotten a fine. What are you doing? Also, I want to touch about that whole Shouta being, quote-unquote, forced or pressured into doing this. Right? That not being a lie, but then that being a lie, but then Emi saying, like, Shouta chose this being the truth. Because both of them are the truth and the lie. Did he want to do this and whatever? Was he forced into doing this? Yes. In a way, he was forced into becoming a blood donor and doing this mission. But he's choosing to do it because this mission is everything to him. He would rather die than not complete this mission. He would die for this mission. Literally, he is throwing away his dignity. He's throwing away everything for this mission. Nothing else matters. No one else matters. What matters to him right now is that mission and that mission alone. But yeah, that's all the notes I have for today. So, as always, my raindrops, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds. Have a wonderful day or night. Link to my Discord server and socials are down in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.